If I had to pick my favourite music act of all time, it would without doubt be Metallica. Since forming in 1981, they have gone to release several albums and have become one of the greatest and most important metal bands of all time. In this video, I'll be ranking all their albums based solely on my opinion, so please go easy in the comments, this is just for fun. I'll be ranking all 11 studio albums and Garage Inc. in this video, giving my thoughts on all of them. And with that out the way, let's get into the ranking. In last place we have Hardwired to Self-Destruct. This album definitely isn't bad by any means, but feels very uninspired and repetitive in places. A lot of these songs feel like downgrades of their 80s and 90s song, with in my opinion Man Unkind being the worst song they've released on a studio album. However, this album does have bright patches. Spit Out the Bone is definitely one of their best songs, which would not look so out of place on an album like Master of Puppets or Justice for All. Moth into Flame and Hardwired are also both solid songs, and Laws of Summer, despite only being a bonus track, is a very good song. Overall, I think this album has some good songs, but is let down by the rest, and for me is the worst in their discography. Many people have this album in last place, but I have it here in 11th. This album has some great songs, but in some places feels very bland. The lack of guitar solos and good drum production is very damaging to this album. I also think some of the songs are far too long, such as Some Kind of Monster, which has to be one of my least favourite Metallica songs. However, like Hardwired, this album does have some very good features. For one, the riffing on this album is incredible on songs such as Dirty Window and Invisible Kid, and almost makes up for the lack of guitar solos. I also think Lars's drumming is very good when you get past the rough drum production. My favourite song on this album without a doubt is The Unnamed Feeling, although Sweet Amber is a very close second. This album had some great potential but fell short of it, and compared to other releases in 2003 such as Meteor by Linkin Park, has not aged particularly well. I think Reload is a solid album, but just has a few very boring songs such as Slither or Better Than You. These filler songs really should have been left off the album, as not only do they drag Reload down, but also haven't been played live at all. The highlights of this album for me are the album opener Fuel and closer Fixer. Both are amazing, with Fuel being one of the thrashiest Metallica songs in the 90s, and Fixer being one of James Hetfield's best vocal performances in their discography. The ballads on this album also stand out to me, with The Unforgiven 2 and Where the Wild Things Are being my two favourite songs after Fixer and Fuel. I think I'd like this album a lot more if it lost some of the filler tracks or merged with the best songs of Load, but for now I have it in 10th. In 9th, I have the band's latest release, 72 Seasons. I think this album suffers from slightly similar issues to Hardwired, but on a much smaller scale. While songs like Crown of Barbed Wire and If Darkness Had a Song are very boring and feel uninspired, the best songs in this album more than make up for that. Inamorata is easily one of my favourite songs on this album, and one of the most beautiful songs I've heard in their whole discography, with the interlude and harmonic parts playing a big part in that. Room of Mirrors, 72 Seasons and Lux Eterna are also all amazing songs that wouldn't feel out of place on one of their earlier albums. Overall, I think this album is very good and a big improvement from Hardwired, but still has a couple of issues keeping it down here in 9th. Despite being just a cover album, I think Garage Inc. is an amazing album and has some of the greatest cover songs of all time. Seeing Metallica's touch on legendary bands such as Black Sabbath, The Misfits and Motorhead is amazing, and makes them feel like original songs. And yes, there may be a couple weak songs on this album, but only 2 songs out of 27 songs on this album doesn't take away from the amazing experience for me. This album has also exposed countless Metallica fans to new bands, and without this album they would not have heard these legendary bands. I really hope before they retire we get a sequel to this album, as it is fantastic and there are plenty of songs since its release Metallica have covered but have not released. From here the albums start to become very tough to rank, as all of these are some of my favourite albums ever released, but in 7th place I have Death Magnetic from 2008. I hold this album in high regard as it was the second Metallica album I listened to and I have enjoyed it ever since. Some of these songs could fit perfectly on 80s thrash metal albums, such as my favourite song The Day That Never Comes, which is one of their best songs in my opinion. Songs like All Nightmare Long, That Was Just Your Life and My Apocalypse are also incredible and could fit on an album like And Justice for All. Despite the rough production, this album is their perfect return to form the band were desperately needing after the rough patch they experienced in the early 2000s, and is definitely one of their better albums for me. In 6th I have their debut album Kill 'Em All. This is undoubtedly one of the most important metal albums of all time, as it showed the world the potential Metallica had and introduced the world to thrash metal, a genre that would come to dominate the 80s metal scene and move bands like Metallica, Megadeth, and Slayer to the status of some of the greatest metal bands in history. My favourite feature of this album is the rawness of the guitar tone, as it is completely unique and adds to its greatness. Songs like The Four Horsemen, Seek and Destroy, Hit the Lights and Metal Militia are some of the band's best and show they were just about to begin their dominance over metal. Overall, I think this is a very strong, very important album that showed us they would just had so much more to give in the future, which we would see. "1986 was without doubt the peak of thrash, as we got heavy hitters such as Peace Sells But Who's Buying by Megadeth, Rain in Blood by Slayer, and of course this, Master of Puppets by Metallica. Widely recognised as one of the greatest metal albums of all time, this album is loaded with classics. Welcome Home Sanitarium, in my opinion, is one of the greatest songs of all time, and my second favourite Metallica song, with it being a mix of beautiful ballad writing and pure thrash excellence. Every single other song on this album also provides an amazing listen, such as the top-class riffing of Disposable Heroes, Damage Inc., the heaviness of The Thing That Should Not Be, and Cliff Burton's bass masterclass on Orion. The only thing keeping this album from not being higher for me is that I've heard the title track far too many times that it doesn't really hold up anymore for me. But nevertheless, this album is an absolute masterpiece and deserves its spot as one of the greatest metal albums of all time. Load is without doubt the most underrated Metallica album and is given very little respect by a lot of metal fans. To me, this album is a masterpiece and has some of the band's best, most catchy songwriting in their whole catalogue. This album contains James Hetfield's best vocals, with my personal favourites on this album, Bleeding Me, The Outlaw Torn and Hero of the Day, being James' 3 best vocal performances in their whole discography. The bluesy songs on this album, such as 2x4, are also completely unique and something I really would love to see the band do in the future. And while this album does contain a couple filler songs such as Poor Twisted Me and The Thorn Within, the best songs more than make up for it, as Load contains some of their best songs. Overall, this album deserves so much more love than it gets and is without doubt one of Metallica's best works for me, but just misses out on top 3. The Black Album is without doubt the most popular metal album of all time and the most important album in the genre, other than Black Sabbath's self-titled album, which created the whole genre. It is the album that introduced me and countless others to the genre of metal, and I've loved it ever since. It contains the best production on any metal album and is full of songs that are classics such as Enter Sandman and Nothing Else Matters, which are known even by non-metal fans. It also contains some of James's best lyric writing, as he speaks from his life experiences, which can be heard on songs like The Unforgiven and The God That Failed. What adds this album's perfection is how it still holds up amazingly against the amount of legendary albums released in 1991. Nirvana's Nevermind, Pearl Jam's 10, and Guns N' Roses' Use Your Illusion 1 and 2, to name just a few, were released in 1991, yet the Black Album still stands out as one of the greatest albums of all time, being the highest selling metal album. To summarise, this album is objectively the greatest metal album of all time, but for me is beaten out by two more Metallica albums. These top two albums could really go either way round, but in second place I have their sophomore album, Ride the Lightning. This album contains some of metal's greatest songs and best instrument playing of all time, with all four members and Dave Mustaine showing just how good they were. It shows Metallica were capable of writing multiple styles, including thrash on songs like Fight Fire with Fire and Creeping Death, and ballads on songs like Fade to Black. It also includes some of the best guitar playing on a metal album, with Ride the Lightning, Fade to Black and Creeping Death being some of the greatest guitar solos in the genre. It also shows the peak of Cliff Burton's songwriting, with this album containing both his most songwriting contributions and some of his best playing of all time. I would usually mention a flaw in an album, but for this one I simply can't. Ride the Lightning is the perfect album and is personally in my top 5 albums of all time. However, there can only be one number one. To put it simply, And Justice for All is my favourite album of all time. This is the album that inspired me to start playing drums, with Lars Ulrich proving that he is in fact a fantastic drummer and deserves more credit than people give him. This album presents a band mourning the death of Cliff Burton, a driving force in songwriting at the time, and using their pain and anger to create an absolute masterpiece. The band are at their peak on this album, with James and Kirk presenting some of their best riffing and soloing, and Lars presenting some of his best drumming in his career. My favourite song of all time, One, is the perfect metal song which takes brilliance of songs like Fade to Black and Sanitarium and amplifies it to another level, showing some of the best songwriting and lyricism. Blackened and Die As Eve are also perfect thrash songs and shows just how good James, Lars, Kirk and Jason are. To Live Is To Die also shows the emotion and pain the band were going through at the time, with the interlude being the saddest moment in the band's discography in my opinion. I could talk about this album for hours on end, but I'll leave it at this point. While this album, yes, has no audible bass, it is perfect in every other way and deserves the praise for it. And that is the end of my rant. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the channel, as me, Tom and Scooby will all be making wide ranges of content, from gaming to music to TV shows, and I'm sure you'd all enjoy it. Anyway, thanks for watching.